It's not always about adding to the architecture or the design. It's about aligning the two. And that's, something to keep in mind. So if you have a house that lends very Art Deco, let's say, and that's just not your design style, how to navigate that? I mean, it depends. Art Deco to me is more about design aesthetic than it is about architecture. Let's talk about architecture that elevates. So, most of us, when we think about architecture, we think, maybe front elevation of a home or like grandeur, beam structures, or, whatever it might be, like things that seem extraordinary. And that's true in a lot of cases, but architecture can also be defined through subtle applications or designs within the space. And that's kind of what I want to hone on today is what is the more ordinary or everyday type architecture that most of us experience? And when it's lacking, how can we actually elevate the existing architecture to maybe
add that next level to it?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many people who are living in like sort of like builder grade style homes or even investment properties that might be sort of simple and they don't have that kind of wow architectural feature. So I want to share some different ideas and ways to evaluate a space and then strategically impact it through architecture. Let me specifically define like elevated architecture, what that really means and how to think about it. Elevated architecture is about proportion and scale to the room. So architecture is, there's depth and layers to architecture. It's not purely just like the structure of a building. It's placement of windows and ceiling heights and millwork features or even features within the internal structure, like maybe trays within ceilings or insets in walls, different niches, anything that affects the actual structure, but it can also lend very much to the design or the intentional design of the building. Something to think about, columns, exposed columns is sometimes done out of structural necessity and sometimes done because somebody thought that was a beautiful architectural feature, not always a load bearing or necessary thing. Also like curves, arches, things like that. You can have, an arched doorway or a barreled ceiling through a hall, all different levels of architecture and all different ways that you can actually modify the internal architecture to create a more intentional or elevated look, depending on what you're trying to achieve.
If you had one arched doorway in the house, like, is that an architectural detail or is that just kind of like somebody tried to cram it in there and maybe we should look at even changing it?
Right. Yeah, I agree. That happens. Maybe they fall in love with the door and they want this specific door. It doesn't really fit the architecture of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Architecture and design should be in alignment and they should be considered on both aspects. Like if you're coming into a space that's already, been constructed, the architecture's already in place, you should design with the architecture in mind as a focal point for each space, depending on the function of that space. You shouldn't be designing apart from what the house already lends architecturally. And if you're doing something new construction or renovation, where you have the opportunity to, modify the architecture or design the architectural side and the, finished design at the same time, it should be a collaborative effort.
They need to blend and
it's cohesive.
Complement.
We should be doing this together. There's a level of harmony that should be occurring between the design and the architecture, regardless of the phase of one or the other. Not all aspects of the architecture need to be the focal point of your design. When done collaboratively, it should all influence each other and be very cohesive and, it's enhancing. One is enhancing the other beauty. The design would be enhancing the architecture that already exists, and the architecture would be enhancing the beauty of the design.
And it all flows together and just it feels uniform.
It's not always about adding to the architecture or the design. It's about aligning the two. And that's, something to keep in mind. So if you have a house that lends very Art Deco, let's say, and that's just not your design style, how to navigate that? I mean, it depends. Art Deco to me is more about design aesthetic than it is about architecture.
So how can we take a home, say, we've talked about some of the builder grade, it's a little bit more of the track. How can you take and add some of these architectural details and make sure that it still flows within the house, or strategically put it in so that it elevates the space and brings that, you can add the, upgrade the perceived value without having to completely redefine and redo the entire space?
Great question. I mean, I would say ceilings are a great place to start. You can do beam work. You can get box beam, faux beams to create the illusion of like big structural beams that are very architecturally appealing. We've already talked about millwork and molding a lot, but ceilings are...
And we can't forget, those are architectural details.
Yeah.
I mean, the millworks, the casements around windows or door headers, those are subtle architectural details. They're not always, architectural details aren't always structural details.
I would go back to what's the function of the space. If you have really tall ceilings and they're just sort of boring, that's a great opportunity to create a little visual up high. So again, you could do beams, or you could even create like a coffered style ceiling, just depending on your scenario. Lighting, you can also do, ornate molding around the tops of the lighting on the ceilings, or add different textures and variations to draw your eye up, to elongate the room that would complement the taller ceilings, the larger scale. I mean, it's a great thing to do with windows too. If you have really, really tall ceilings and your windows are maybe not fully proportionate, you can elongate the window with longer drapes and bring the drapes up really high or higher up to the ceiling to really draw the illusion of the eye up. And that can also help increase the perceived grandeur of that architecture, or make it feel more elevated, and without having to necessarily replace the windows. Also millwork around windows and headers around windows, and same concept as around doors. But architecture is really rooted in a level of visual interest. Anytime you want to elevate an area, you can add dimension and depth and interest through millwork, through textile applications, through, different, like we already mentioned, beamwork, or different applications or different materials that would give it that greater dimension and allow it to have more of a focal point and have a little bit more elevated look. So don't worry if, your existing house or property doesn't already have all of these elevated architectural features. It doesn't mean you have to reconstruct everything. You can creatively approach it to enhance that architectural dimension that you're seeking and give your house more character or depth. Whatever it is that you're trying to achieve doesn't mean you have to tear into the wall to do it.
Yeah, and also remember too, not every space needs a specific or the same detailing. If you've got, like you said, the really tall ceiling and you want to do beamwork to draw the eye up, that doesn't mean in, say, a 14-foot room, doesn't necessarily mean you want to do the same thing in the room that's got the 8-foot ceiling, because that could actually have the opposite
make it feel
effect
smaller, right?
And make it smaller. So it's really lent in proportion to the space. When do you need to really consider investing in doing some of the structural changes, and maybe having an architect come in to help you? Because I would think more in some of the older homes and the way that some of them are built. But, not sure.
Yeah. I mean, anytime you want to open up walls or change the layout, really, where you're removing walls that could be structurally load bearing, that is when you need to make sure you're realistically getting proper design advice for that. Some older homes don't really have the open concept that a lot of people like. So even investors will come in and, we're going to flip this house and we're going to open it up to make it the kitchen more grand. You probably need to make sure, you have the structural
Not to say that it can't be done, that you
Right.
can't open that up, but it needs to be done and done properly. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with a bigger mess on your hand later on.
Yeah. Anytime you're changing anything that's structural, because, you have to think of the architect as like the engineer. They're not your designer necessarily, and they're not your builder necessarily, but they play a very important role in both aspects to ensure that structurally the facility is sound. And a lot of, architectural design lends to that sort of design aspect to incorporate it within to the existing structure, but they play an important role. Should be collaborating with everyone.
With some of the architectural details and things like that, like you got to understand too that not every change we make or detail that we add necessarily adds a equated dollar for dollar value, but it can change the mood and the feel and the functionality of the space.
Yeah.
Which can lead to a perceived value.
And sometimes, you don't actually need an architect. You just need a framer that knows what they're doing, because it may not always be that you need some massive architectural, structural beam, but it's not for the faint of heart. Like, these framers, these tradesmen know how to make sure things get framed up properly too, to be able to open spaces up. So let's wrap this bad boy up. Remember, architecture is really important, and it's important to consider when you're designing and when you're optimizing your investment to get that full return on design. You need to consider it. One way to really do that is to start, changing the way you're viewing a space. Don't just focus on the end aesthetic result. Look at what's existing, what the existing proportions are. And I think if you can train your mind to do that, you'll start to be able to recognize potential that could already be there that needs to just be uncovered, or potential of what could be done to really give you that elevated architectural design that can, dramatically change a space.
So remember that when you're looking at the details and you're looking at these architectural points, look at what's already existing, look at what's there and what the style home, and it'll oftentimes lead you in the ways that you can go with what you may want to add, or if you really even need to add anything architecturally. And it can help you make the decision simpler and even sometimes more effectively to create the look and the feel of what you're going for.
Yeah, or even enhance the sellability. Sometimes houses don't sell because they're architecturally a little strange. When you can start identifying the potential of what some people might perceive as strange, but you can fix it or correct it, bring that order and make it more purposeful. There's a lot of opportunity there to come in and flip these houses around and put them back on the market and get some return on strategically approaching it that way. So if you like what you heard today and you're starting to think, a little more strategically about how to notice architectural details and how to elevate architectural details, make sure you're following, subscribe. We have a lot more content to share with you. You can also tag us at ReturnOnDesign on socials and tell us about your architectural challenges or wins. And of course, drop in the comments. Like if there's a topic you want to hear us talk about that we haven't covered, or something you think we should dive deeper in, we want to know. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following along and stay tuned till next time.
We'll see you next time.